Officer Daniel Grant had never expected a typical morning patrol to change his life. But that particular morning was different. The sky was dull, covered with thick layers of clouds, and the wind sliced through the quiet suburban streets like a dull blade. It was the kind of day that made people want to stay inside, wrapped in blankets with a cup of coffee in hand. Daniel was used to the early mornings. The pre-dawn shifts had become routine. He knew the roads, the alleys, the corners where trouble sometimes brewed. His patrol car hummed quietly beneath him as he drove the same route he'd driven hundreds of times before. His eyes scanned the streets automatically, catching the usual signs of early morning life, streetlights flickering off, a couple of stray dogs looking for food, and the occasional car headed to a 24-hour diner. But today, something caught his attention. It was her. At first, he thought he might be seeing things. As his headlights sliced through the foggy morning air, he saw her, a woman walking alone along the long stretch of highway that cut through the heart of town. She was a tiny figure, her features lost in the mist, but the way she walked stood out. Her pace was steady, determined. She moved with purpose, as though she had somewhere important to be. Daniel leaned forward in his seat, squinting. Who walks down this stretch of highway at 5 in the morning? Especially a woman, alone? His instinct was to drive on, to continue his usual patrol. But something about her caught his attention. She wasn't walking like someone who had just missed a bus. There was no hurried shuffle or glance over her shoulder. Her steps were rhythmic, deliberate. As if she'd done this countless times before. He glanced at the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty. The only thing ahead of him was her. His curiosity grew. Slowing his car, Daniel turned the wheel and maneuvered into a parking lot across the street. He killed the engine, the low hum of his patrol car replaced by the heavy silence of the morning. The woman, still some distance ahead, didn't seem to notice him. She was walking at an even pace, her head down, her eyes focused ahead. She didn't glance around or seem distracted by the world around her. She was lost in thought, or perhaps she had simply learned to ignore everything else. The air was cold, stinging Daniel's face as he stepped out of the car. The dampness in the atmosphere hung around him, settling into his uniform. He pulled up the collar of his jacket and locked the door behind him. The sound of his boots crunching on the gravel was loud in the silence as he began walking in her direction. There was no immediate danger. She wasn't running, she wasn't acting suspicious, yet he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something wrong. No one walked these roads at this hour unless there was a reason. He kept his distance at first, allowing her to maintain her pace, his eyes on her back. He was a good distance away, yet close enough that he could see the faint details of her appearance. She wore a heavy coat, a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, and a pair of well-worn boots. She didn't look like she was in a hurry. In fact, she looked almost resigned. Daniel followed her for a few minutes, the fog swirling around them both. He could hear the distant sound of cars passing on the highway, but everything else was eerily quiet. As he walked behind her, his thoughts wandered. What was she doing out here? What was her story? The road was long and lonely, with stretches of open fields on either side. The kind of place you wouldn't expect anyone to walk, let alone a woman alone in the dark. The more he thought about it, the more questions crept into his mind. Did she not have a car? Was she on some sort of mission? The road wasn't even near any bus stops or main thoroughfares. There was no reason anyone should be walking this stretch of highway at this time of day unless they had no other choice. And then, just as he was about to call it in, just as he was about to turn around and leave her to her business, she stopped. In a heartbeat, she came to a complete halt, her shoulders tensing under her coat. Daniel didn't know whether to stop or keep walking, but instinctively, he slowed down. She stood still, her back turned to him, her figure framed by the fog. For a long moment, the two of them just stood there. Daniel's heart rate picked up, the quiet moment hanging between them like a thin thread, about to snap. And then she turned. She didn't start walking again. She didn't act surprised, or angry, or afraid. She simply turned, her eyes locking with his. Her gaze was intense, steady, unblinking, almost as if she had been waiting for him. Waiting for him to make his move. "I see you," she said, her voice soft but certain. "You don't have to follow me anymore." Daniel froze. The words hit him like a cold splash of water. He had expected her to be frightened, to be angry, or maybe even confused by his presence. But this was something different. She hadn't asked who he was or why he was following her. She hadn't given him any sign of fear or suspicion. It was as though she had been aware of his presence the whole time. Daniel opened his mouth, his words caught in his throat. His heart was pounding in his chest. I didn't mean to." "I know what you're thinking," she interrupted, cutting him off with an odd calmness. "But you don't need to follow me. You'll never understand." His mind was racing. "Understand? What do you mean?" The woman's lips parted slightly as though to answer him, but then she stopped. Her gaze shifted, her eyes moving from him to the road ahead as if something had just shifted in the air. "I can't tell you," she finally said. "You wouldn't believe me anyway." With that, she turned and began walking again, faster this time. No hesitation. No second glance. She just walked, the steady rhythm of her feet against the pavement echoing in the quiet morning. Daniel stood still for a moment, his mind racing. What had just happened? She hadn't seemed afraid, but there was something in her voice that suggested she knew something he didn't. Something she was keeping from him. He watched her retreating figure for a moment, his thoughts swirling. He had no real reason to keep following her. It was just a woman walking. No crime, no emergency. But there was something magnetic about the way she'd spoken, something that didn't sit right in his gut. His instincts were telling him to walk away, to leave her be. She had made it clear she didn't want his help. But then again, his curiosity was almost unbearable. What was her story? Why was she walking alone on this desolate highway every day? And what was it that she couldn't tell him? Daniel took a deep breath and made up his mind. He wasn't going to just walk away. Not yet. He would follow her, just a little longer. He would find out what was going on. As he followed her at a distance, a strange sense of foreboding settled over him. The air grew colder, and the fog thickened, hiding the world from view. His mind kept replaying her words, "You wouldn't believe me anyway." This wasn't just a woman walking to work. There was something much bigger at play here. Something he needed to figure out. Daniel Grant could feel his breath catch in the cold air as he watched the woman's figure disappear into the mist ahead of him. The decision to follow her, despite everything telling him to turn back, was already beginning to gnaw at him. Something about her, something about the way she had spoken, triggered a feeling in him that he couldn't shake. As he walked, his footsteps quickened to match hers. The sound of his boots crunching on the gravel felt louder now, almost intrusive, as if the world around him had gone completely still. The fog clung to the trees, to the barren fields, swallowing up everything around them. He didn't know what he expected to find, maybe nothing at all. Maybe she was just an ordinary woman with an unusual routine, someone who had her own reasons for walking this long stretch of highway day after day. But his gut told him that the answers were far from simple. She had already spoken to him, or rather, spoken at him, telling him he wouldn't believe her. But why? What could she possibly have to hide? And why had she seemed so certain that he wasn't capable of understanding whatever it was? A million questions flooded his mind as he quickened his pace to match hers. She hadn't slowed down, if anything, her steps seemed to grow more deliberate, faster, as though she had made up her mind to not be followed. But Daniel was persistent. His curiosity was louder than his instincts to leave her alone. For several minutes, they walked in near silence, the only sound the steady rhythm of their footsteps and the occasional gust of wind that blew through the trees. Then, unexpectedly, she stopped again. This time, her abrupt halt was more deliberate. She didn't spin around like she had before, but instead, she simply came to a stop and stood perfectly still, as though waiting for him to catch up. The mist curled around her, obscuring her figure as if she had become part of the fog itself. Daniel hesitated, but only for a moment. His heart beat faster, his every instinct telling him to stop, to turn around, to leave. But he couldn't. Something inside him told him that this moment, whatever it was, held the key to everything. He had to know. He took one last step toward her, just enough to be within talking distance. "You don't have to keep following me," she said, without turning to face him. Her voice was quieter this time, a little more resigned, but still steady. "Why?" Daniel asked, his voice almost a whisper. "Why are you walking out here? Every day?" She didn't respond right away. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the wind rustling through the trees. It was as if she was deciding whether to reveal anything more, whether to trust him with the truth. Finally, she spoke, her words careful, deliberate. "I walk because I have no choice." Daniel frowned. There was something more in her tone now, a hint of vulnerability that hadn't been there before. Something about the way she said it, as if she had told herself that so many times that it had become a mantra. "I'm not following you to cause trouble," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice calm. I don't understand. What's so urgent that you have to walk 20 miles to work every day?" She exhaled slowly, a deep sigh that seemed to carry years of pain with it. She didn't look back, but Daniel could hear the change in her voice, a crack beneath the surface. "It's not about the miles," she said. "It's about the life I've been forced to live." The word struck him harder than he expected. He stood there, silent, waiting for her to elaborate. The woman seemed to gather herself for a moment before she spoke again, but this time, it was as if she were speaking more to herself than to him. "I don't have a car," she said, as though it was the simplest explanation in the world. But Daniel didn't buy it. There was something deeper, something darker in her words. "I don't have anyone to depend on. And I can't rely on the buses. Not anymore." Her voice broke slightly, and Daniel could hear the pain she had tried to bury under her stoic demeanor. This was no ordinary commute. This was survival. The fog had thickened around them, making the world feel smaller, more intimate. He could feel the weight of her story, even though she hadn't said much. But in that brief moment, something in her eyes, a deep sadness mixed with defiance, told him she wasn't just walking because she had no other choice. There was something more. Daniel took a tentative step closer, his breath visible in the air between them. "What happened?" Her gaze flickered to the ground for just a second before she raised her eyes to meet his. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper, as if sharing this with him was a risk in itself. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she said again, her voice thick with emotion. "No one does." The words hung in the air between them, unanswered. Daniel could feel a knot tighten in his stomach. He could hear the truth in her words, but she wasn't ready to share it with him yet. It was clear there was more to her story. Much more. But what was it? Before he could ask another question, the woman turned away from him, her coat swishing as she started walking again. Her pace was steady, but there was a noticeable tension in her steps now. She wasn't just walking to work anymore. She was walking away from something, or running toward something, he couldn't yet understand. "Wait," Daniel called after her. "Please, tell me what's going on." But she didn't stop. Instead, she glanced back at him, just long enough to meet his eyes. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in it, something like regret. "I told you," she said softly. You wouldn't believe me. Then she walked faster, disappearing into the fog like a ghost. Daniel stood there, his heart racing. Her words echoed in his mind. You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Why? What was it she couldn't say? What was the truth she was keeping from him, and why was she so certain he couldn't handle it? He had already made up his mind, he couldn't let this go. He wouldn't let it go. There was something buried here, something that made her walk alone in the dark, something that had driven her to this strange, solitary routine. Daniel turned and began walking again, keeping a little distance behind her this time, but never losing sight of her. This woman had secrets, secrets that made her walk 20 miles every day, secrets that ran deeper than anything he had imagined. And he was going to find out what they were. The fog hung thick in the air, a ghostly veil that wrapped around the landscape. Daniel walked steadily behind the woman, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragments of their brief conversation. She had told him just enough to spark his curiosity but had left him with more questions than answers. He could see her breath now, puffing out in little clouds of white against the gray morning. But she didn't turn back, didn't acknowledge his presence, as though she were locked in her own thoughts, her own world. He caught up to her again, his voice strained from the exertion. Please, he said, trying once more. You don't have to carry this alone. I don't know what's happened to you, but you don't have to do this by yourself. Let me help. She finally slowed her pace, but not to look at him. She stared straight ahead, her eyes focused on something far beyond where they stood. Daniel felt her walls harden again, a barrier between them that felt almost impenetrable. You think you can help me? She said, her voice so low it was almost a whisper. You can't help me. No one can. Daniel felt a pang of frustration rise in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He needed to be patient. He needed to understand her, not push her. But the mystery had been eating away at him. He had to know what was driving her, what made her so certain that help wasn't an option. Why not? He asked, his tone softer now, trying to reach her. You don't have to face whatever it is alone. There's always a way out. She turned her head slightly, just enough so that he could see the corner of her eye. It was the first time she had acknowledged him so directly since they started this strange, silent march together. You don't get it, she said, her voice cracking just a little. I'm not walking because I want to. I'm walking because I'm trying to forget. I'm trying to outrun what I did. The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. Forget? Outrun? He had been assuming that she was escaping some kind of danger or hardship, but this? This was different. She wasn't just running from something outside herself. She was running from something that lived within her. What do you mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What are you trying to outrun? For a long moment, she didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. She just kept walking, her footsteps steady against the cold, damp pavement. But Daniel could see the tremor in her hands now, the way they twitched at her sides, like she was fighting to hold herself together. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke again, and her voice was so faint that Daniel almost missed it. I killed him. The words shattered the silence like a slap to the face. Daniel's stomach dropped. The revelation hit him like a wave, crashing over him, and he felt his breath catch in his chest. This wasn't what he had expected. This wasn't the kind of secret he had been anticipating. I didn't mean to, she continued, her voice shaky now. It was an accident, but I couldn't fix it. I couldn't undo it. And I've been running ever since. Every day, every mile, hoping that maybe if I just keep walking, I can leave it behind. But it's never gone. It's never going to be gone. Her words hung in the air. Raw and painful, like a wound that refused to heal. Daniel stood there, frozen, unsure of what to say. He had been prepared for a mystery, something he could solve with logic and reasoning. But this wasn't a puzzle. It was a cry for help, a confession from a woman burdened by guilt so deep that it had consumed her life. He felt the weight of her grief pressing down on him, suffocating. She had killed someone, accidentally, she said, but the guilt was so overpowering that she couldn't escape it. And now, she was walking miles every day, hoping that distance would somehow absolve her, hoping that with each step, the pain would fade. "Why don't you tell the police?" Daniel asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Maybe you can find a way to make this right. Maybe there's more to it than you think." She shook her head again, her pace quickening once more. "It's too late for that," she said. "I can't change what I did. I can't bring him back. And even if I could, it wouldn't matter. The guilt is mine to carry, and mine alone." Daniel wanted to reach out, to stop her, to tell her that there were always ways to make things right, always ways to heal. But there was something in her eyes, a finality, a resignation, that told him she wasn't ready to hear it. She wasn't ready to face the truth, not yet. But maybe he could help her. Maybe there was still a way to get through to her, to show her that running wasn't the answer. They continued walking in silence for what felt like an eternity. The road stretched on before them, endless, like the miles she had already walked. Daniel's mind was spinning, trying to piece together what she had just shared. He could feel the weight of her confession pressing down on him, and he knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about a woman walking to work. This was about a woman struggling to live with the consequences of a mistake that had shattered her life. Finally, she stopped again. This time, there was no rushing forward. She stood still, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, almost as if she were apologizing to herself. "I never wanted anyone to know. But now you do. And I'm sorry for that." Daniel's heart ached. He didn't know how to help her, didn't know what to say to ease the pain in her voice. But one thing was clear, she wasn't alone anymore. He wasn't going to let her walk this road alone. "What's your name?" he asked softly, his voice full of quiet empathy. She turned to him, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to go on forever. For a brief moment, he thought she might not answer. But then she spoke. "My name is Emily," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emily," Daniel repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. "I'm not going to let you walk this road by yourself anymore. We'll figure this out together." But Emily just shook her head, her expression distant. "You don't understand. You can't understand." And with that, she turned and walked away again, leaving Daniel standing in the cold fog, his mind racing with questions and the deep, overwhelming sense that he was on the brink of something far darker than he had ever imagined. Daniel watched as Emily continued down the street, her footsteps slow but determined, her body bent under a weight that no one could see. She had told him everything, or so it seemed. But the more he thought about it, the more questions lingered in his mind. What exactly had she done? What kind of accident could possibly be so devastating that it drove a person to such lengths? The fog thickened around him, and the air grew colder. He could still feel the tremor in his chest from the confession she'd made, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a stone. She hadn't just killed someone, she had taken something vital, something irreplaceable from someone's life. And now she was carrying the unbearable burden of that choice, step after painful step. Daniel wasn't sure what to do next. He'd followed her for hours, listened to her heartbreaking revelation, and watched as she walked away, alone in her grief. He considered calling someone, maybe the police, or a counselor, someone who could help her. But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, he immediately dismissed it. Emily wasn't ready to confront the reality of what had happened. Not yet. He could see it in her eyes, the way they had darkened when she spoke of her guilt. She wasn't looking for a way out, not yet. She was still trying to outrun her past, even though it was right there with her every step of the way. He had to find a way to get through to her. If he didn't, the distance she had walked would only continue to grow, and she would be lost forever to her own remorse. He called after her, his voice breaking the silence. "Emily, wait." She didn't stop. She didn't even look back. Daniel's frustration boiled over. He ran to catch up to her, his legs burning with the effort, the sound of his own footsteps lost in the rhythm of hers. "Emily, please," he said again, his voice urgent. "You don't have to do this. You don't have to run anymore. I'm not going to let you keep running." Finally, she stopped. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. Daniel slowed down, breathless, his chest tight with anxiety. He reached her, standing beside her, but for a moment, neither of them spoke. The cold fog swirled around them, settling on their skin like the weight of the world. "I don't know how to make it right," she said quietly, her voice cracking. She kept her eyes fixed on the pavement, not daring to look at him. "I can't undo it, Daniel. It's too late for that. You don't understand. No one does." Daniel could feel the tears welling up in his own eyes. He didn't know what to say. How could he? How could anyone understand the kind of guilt that could make someone feel so trapped? The mistake Emily had made had been so catastrophic that even the simplest words of comfort seemed pointless. "I understand more than you think," he said softly, his voice filled with an empathy that he wasn't sure Emily would believe. "I may not know exactly what you're feeling, but I understand what it's like to be haunted by something. To carry it with you every single day and wonder if there's any way to make it stop. To wonder if you'll ever be able to forgive yourself." She turned her head, meeting his gaze for the first time in what felt like forever. Her eyes were filled with tears, the raw pain of her soul exposed for the first time. There was something in her gaze that made his heart break for her, a kind of vulnerability that he hadn't seen before. "I don't know if I can forgive myself," she whispered. "I don't even know if I deserve to. He's gone, Daniel. And I can't fix it. No matter how many miles I walk, no matter how many days I spend trying to outrun it, it won't change. The guilt is always there. It's always going to be a part of me." The weight of her words crushed him, and he felt his heart ache for her, a deep, gnawing ache that couldn't be healed by just saying the right words. He wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, that she could start over, but deep down, he knew that was a lie. There were some things you could never undo. There were some things you had to carry with you forever. But that didn't mean she was alone. And it didn't mean she couldn't heal. The road ahead would be long, yes, but it didn't have to be walked in silence. "You don't have to do this alone, Emily," he said again, his voice steady, firm. "You can't carry this on your own forever. You're not meant to. I don't have all the answers, but I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." For a long moment, she didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply stood there, staring at him, as though trying to decide whether she could trust him, or whether it was even worth trying. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can let anyone in again. After what happened. I pushed everyone away. I didn't want anyone to know. I couldn't bear it. But you're still here. Why?" Daniel took a deep breath. He didn't have an easy answer. He wasn't sure why he had kept following her. He wasn't sure why he felt this pull to help her when so many others would have just walked away. "I think it's because I see you," he said simply. "I see the pain. And I see that you're still fighting, even when you think there's nothing left to fight for. Maybe I don't have the answers, but I know you don't have to walk this road by yourself." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, she let them fall. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed by her own vulnerability. "I'm so tired, Daniel," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm so tired of running. But I don't know how to stop." "I know," he said, his voice filled with compassion. "But we'll figure it out. Together." Emily looked up at him, her expression torn. She seemed as though she wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that things could change. But the weight of her past was like a chain around her heart, keeping her bound to the mistakes she had made. "I don't deserve forgiveness," she whispered. "No one ever does," Daniel replied quietly. "But forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you give. To yourself. And maybe one day, you'll be able to forgive yourself for what happened. But right now, let me help you find peace. You don't have to walk this road anymore. Not by yourself." The words seemed to hang in the air, suspended between them like a fragile thread. It was a quiet moment, one that felt like the calm before the storm. Emily's life had been filled with so much chaos, so much pain. But maybe, just maybe, she was ready to take the first step toward healing. With a deep breath, she nodded, her voice barely audible. "Okay. I'll try." Daniel smiled, a small, hopeful smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And for the first time in a long while, Emily didn't feel quite so alone. The next few days were a blur. Emily walked the same path every morning, but it was different now. There was no longer the desperate need to escape the past. Instead, each step she took felt like a tentative march towards something she couldn't yet see. The weight of her guilt still pressed down on her like a stone, but it wasn't as crushing as it had been before. Daniel had given her a lifeline, one she wasn't sure she deserved, but one that she couldn't let go of. But healing, as Emily was learning, wasn't a straight line. It wasn't something you could just decide to do and then watch it unfold like a neatly packaged promise. It was messy, confusing, painful. Every moment of relief was followed by another wave of doubt, another flash of the past that threatened to drag her back into the darkness. One morning, as she made her way down the familiar street, Emily felt an uncomfortable tightness in her chest. Her breath quickened, and she could feel her heart pounding in her ears. She wasn't sure what triggered it, a thought, a memory, a feeling, but suddenly, the ground beneath her feet felt like it was slipping away. The accident. The moment everything changed. She stumbled, nearly tripping over a crack in the sidewalk, but she caught herself just in time. The dizziness passed as quickly as it had come, but the pain of the memory lingered. She closed her eyes, trying to shake it off, but it was always there, waiting for her. She needed to talk to Daniel. She needed to make sense of everything before it consumed her again. She found him sitting on the same park bench where they'd first talked, staring out at the street, lost in thought. His face was tired, the lines around his eyes more pronounced than they had been before. He'd been there every step of the way, walking alongside her, offering support when she couldn't even bring herself to ask for it. But today, she saw something in his expression, something that made her feel uneasy. Daniel wasn't the same person she had met days ago. He seemed distant, a little withdrawn. He wasn't meeting her eyes as he usually did. "Daniel?" Her voice trembled slightly, her words laced with concern. He turned to her slowly, his gaze unfocused. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Emily. You okay?" She hesitated before sitting down beside him. "I should be asking you that. You've been acting off." He chuckled softly, but it was hollow. "I'm fine. Just thinking." Emily didn't buy it. There was a weight in the air between them now, something unspoken that hung over them like a storm cloud. She had been so focused on her own struggles, her own guilt, that she hadn't noticed how much Daniel had been carrying too. The quiet ache in his voice was a reminder that they weren't the only ones dealing with unresolved pain. She studied him for a moment, her heart heavy with an understanding she hadn't had before. "Daniel, what's going on? You've been different since we last talked. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if trying to work through his thoughts. It's nothing, really. Just. I don't know. I guess I've been thinking about the whole thing. You know, your story. Emily's stomach twisted. She had told him everything, everything she thought was important, but now, as she looked at him, she realized there was more that he didn't know. More that she hadn't said. He turned to face her more fully, his expression serious. You've been carrying all of this alone for so long, Emily. But there's something about the way you're handling it now, the way you've been walking every day. I think you're trying to make up for something, aren't you? Emily's breath caught. She hadn't realized how much of herself she had revealed in the last few days, how much of her pain and guilt she had poured into him. It wasn't intentional. She hadn't meant to drag him into her mess, but somehow, in some way, he had become part of it. Daniel, her voice cracked as she searched for the right words. I don't think I can ever make up for what I did. I don't think I can fix it. He shook his head slowly, his expression softening. That's not what I meant. What I'm saying is, maybe you're not supposed to fix it. Not all at once. Maybe you're just supposed to start living with it. Living with it? Emily repeated, her voice barely a whisper. How do you live with something like that? Slowly, Daniel said. His voice was quieter now, more gentle, as though he was speaking from his own experience. One day at a time. You can't undo what's been done. But you can decide to keep moving forward. Even if you don't know where that road is leading yet. Emily felt the sting of his words deep in her chest. The road she was on felt endless, stretching out before her like a fog she couldn't see through. She had no idea where it would lead. She wasn't even sure she wanted to keep walking. But Daniel was right about one thing. The road didn't end just because she wanted it to. It kept going. Whether she was ready or not, it kept going. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. But what if I can't do it? What if I get lost again? Daniel reached out and placed a hand on hers, his grip warm, steady. Then you'll find your way again. You're not alone in this, Emily. Not anymore. The weight of his words settled over her like a blanket. She didn't know if she could believe it, if she could ever fully believe that things would get better. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. Not a promise, not a certainty, but a glimmer. A possibility. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know where I'd be without you. Daniel squeezed her hand, his eyes meeting hers with an understanding that was deeper than words. I'll always be here, Emily. We'll figure it out together. Later that evening, as Emily walked the final stretch of her daily route, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the conversation lingering in her mind. She had started to believe, for the first time, that maybe it wasn't about fixing everything all at once. Maybe it was about allowing herself to heal, step by step. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had once thought. The fog had started to lift, both in the world around her and in her heart. She could see the distant lights of her home, the warmth of it waiting for her. But as she walked the final steps, the familiar sound of a car pulling up behind her broke her focus. She turned, startled, and saw a figure emerge from the darkness. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by the dim light. He wasn't someone she recognized, but there was something in his eyes, a kind of recognition, that made her freeze. Emily, the man said, his voice low and steady. I need to talk to you. The man's voice sent a cold shiver down Emily's spine. She stood still, the evening air thick with tension. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a split second, she wondered if she had heard wrong. But the words were unmistakable, and the man's gaze was unyielding. There was something about him that was impossible to ignore. Emily, he repeated, his voice quieter now, almost too calm. "I really need to talk to you." She took a cautious step back, instinctively pulling her jacket tighter around her body. The man was standing just a few feet away from her now, but he was no longer in the shadows. The streetlights revealed his face, and her stomach dropped when she saw the grim expression there. He looked familiar, but not in a way that comforted her. He looked like someone who had been a part of her life, but for reasons she couldn't quite place, she couldn't remember exactly why. "Do I know you?" Emily's voice trembled despite her best efforts to steady it. The man's face softened ever so slightly, as though he were expecting her to ask. He glanced around, as if making sure no one else was nearby. "You probably don't recognize me," he said. "But I'm here because I need to warn you." "Warn me?" Emily felt her pulse quicken. "What are you talking about?" His eyes narrowed, and his voice lowered, becoming more urgent. "I know what happened that night, Emily. I know what you're running from." Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The past, those days that she had tried so hard to bury, came rushing back like a flood, and suddenly she wasn't standing on the quiet street in her neighborhood. She was back there, in that moment of fear, confusion, and chaos. "I don't know what you're talking about," Emily managed to say, her voice cracking. She forced her feet to stay planted on the ground, but her mind screamed at her to run. "Don't lie to me," the man said sharply. "You can't hide from the truth forever." Emily took a step back, the ground beneath her feeling unsteady. She was starting to piece together who this man might be, but the more she tried to remember, the blurrier the details became. It was as if he were just out of her grasp, like the face of a ghost fading in and out of memory. "I'm not lying," she said, her voice growing stronger despite the rising panic. "I don't know you. I don't know what you want from me." The man looked at her with something between pity and frustration. "You're not making this easy, Emily. But it's not your fault. You were just trying to survive, weren't you? All of you." Emily flinched. "Stop," she whispered, her chest tightening. "Please, I don't want to talk about it." He ignored her, his voice colder now. "That's why I'm here. To help you understand what happened. Why you've been running all this time. There are things you don't know. Things you won't know unless you listen to me." "I don't need your help," Emily shot back, her hands trembling at her sides. "I'm fine. I've moved on." But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't true. Nothing felt fine. Nothing had been fine for a long time. The man's eyes softened again, and he took a step closer, but still, he kept his distance. "I can see that you're trying, Emily. But you don't have all the pieces. Not yet. I've been following you. I've seen how you've been struggling. But you're not alone in this. You've never been alone." The last part of his statement hit Emily harder than any of his previous words. It struck her with a force that knocked the wind out of her. "I've been following you," he repeated, his tone almost like a confession. "Because you're not the only one who's been running. I've been running too." Emily's mind reeled. Running from what? The man's gaze darkened, and for the first time, there was a flicker of fear in his eyes, real, raw fear. "From the same thing you are. From the same truth. And I'm afraid it's not over yet." Emily stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what he was saying. But the more he spoke, the more she realized she had no idea what he was talking about. The pieces of the puzzle she'd been trying to put together all these months were slipping through her fingers. This man knew something she didn't, something that had been buried deep in the past. "You don't have to be scared, Emily," he continued, his voice softening again. "I'm here to help you. To protect you." "Protect me?" Emily shook her head. "From what?" The man hesitated, then looked around the street once more. They're still out there. And they'll come for you. They'll come for both of us. Emily's stomach churned. She took a step back, her mind racing. Who's they? What are you talking about? The man's face hardened. I wish I didn't have to tell you this. I wish you could stay safe. But I can't keep you in the dark any longer. He paused, as if weighing his next words. The night of the accident wasn't an accident, Emily. Someone made sure it happened. She stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. What? That's not possible. You're wrong. No, I'm not, he said sharply. It wasn't random. It wasn't just a mistake. Someone wanted it to happen. And now they're coming after you. After both of us. Because they think you know something you don't even realize you know. Emily's mind reeled, the words swirling in her head. Her past. The accident. The guilt. But nothing made sense anymore. She had always assumed it was just a horrible mistake, a moment of bad luck. Now, this man was telling her it had all been orchestrated? No, she said, shaking her head, trying to steady herself. You're wrong. I don't know anything. I don't know what you're talking about. But deep down, a seed of doubt had already been planted. Something inside her was telling her that maybe he wasn't lying. That maybe everything she thought she knew about that night, everything she had been trying so hard to forget, was a lie. A carefully constructed lie. And the fear that had been lurking in the back of her mind, the fear that she couldn't shake, no matter how hard she tried, was starting to grow. Who are you? Emily whispered, her voice shaking. The man's expression was unreadable. My name is James, he said quietly. And I've been looking for you. For a long time. Emily stood frozen on the street, her heart pounding in her chest, every nerve in her body on high alert. The streetlights flickered around her, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. The world felt eerily still, as though time itself had stopped. James, this man who claimed to know everything about her past, about the accident, was still standing in front of her. His presence felt like a weight, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. She couldn't comprehend what he had just said. Couldn't accept the possibility that everything she thought she knew about that night had been a lie. He wasn't the only one who had been running. He said they were both being hunted. Hunted for something she didn't even understand. James, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me? James's expression softened, a hint of sadness flickering across his face. I'm not here to hurt you, Emily. I'm here to warn you. Warn me, she echoed, her voice growing stronger. Warn me about what? About the people who've been watching you. The ones who set all of this in motion. They think you know something, Emily. They think you saw something that night, and if they find out you do, they won't stop until they silence you. Emily's mind reeled, her breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. She didn't know what to believe. The past, the accident, her guilt, it was all a jumble of fragmented memories that she couldn't piece together. But James's words felt like a punch to the gut. She didn't want to believe him, didn't want to think that everything she had been running from was still chasing her. You're saying, they've been watching me? She asked, barely able to process the enormity of what he was implying. Yes, James said quietly. 4 months. Ever since that night. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog that seemed to cloud her thoughts. But why? Why me? Because you were there, he said, his voice steady. Because you saw something that they didn't want you to see. Emily's chest tightened. I don't remember anything about that night. I was just. You were just trying to survive, James interrupted, his tone soft but firm. But they know you saw something. A detail, a face, something that connects them to what happened. Her mind raced, trying to pull together the fragments of that night, the accident, the crash, the voices she had heard, the faces she couldn't remember. But the more she thought about it, the more elusive it all became. The pieces wouldn't fit, and the puzzle remained unsolved. "I don't remember," Emily whispered again, as if saying it out loud would make it real. "I don't know what they want from me." James stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "They want to make sure you never remember. They want to erase the evidence, and they won't stop until they do." The words hit her like a wave crashing against the shore. She felt lightheaded, disoriented. She had thought that moving away, walking every day, trying to escape the memories would help her heal. But now, she realized that she had been running from something far bigger than her guilt. She had been running from the truth. "I don't know how to fight this," Emily said, her voice breaking. "How do I fight something like this?" James hesitated, his eyes flickering with what might have been regret. "You don't have to fight it alone. I've been trying to find you for a long time, Emily. I've been watching you, waiting for you to reach out. To finally start asking the right questions." Emily's mind spun. "You've been following me?" James nodded, his expression serious. "I had to make sure you were safe. Had to make sure they didn't get to you first." "Who are they, James?" Emily asked, the desperation in her voice clear. "Who are you really?" James hesitated again, his jaw tightening as though he were struggling with something. "I can't tell you everything, Emily. Not yet. But I can tell you this, the people behind this, they're powerful. They control a lot of things, things you wouldn't even believe. But I've been working to bring them down for years." Emily stared at him, her heart heavy with confusion and fear. She had no idea who James really was or what his motivations were, but one thing was clear, she was in over her head. Her life had never been simple, but it had never felt like this either. The stakes had shifted. She wasn't just running from her past anymore. She was caught in something far bigger. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I couldn't," James said softly. "I wasn't sure you were ready. I wasn't sure you'd believe me." Emily opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, a distant sound caught her attention, an engine revving, tires screeching. It was the unmistakable sound of a car coming their way, fast and furious. Emily's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively took a step back. James's eyes darted to the street, his expression hardening. "We don't have much time," he muttered. "They've found us." Before Emily could respond, James grabbed her arm and pulled her towards the alleyway behind them. "Come on. We need to go now." Emily's legs moved automatically, her body responding before her mind could catch up. She could hear the sound of the car getting closer, the engine roaring louder. They were here. James led her through the maze of dark alleys, his grip tight on her wrist, his pace frantic. Emily's breath came in gasps, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of the situation. Who were these people? What did they want with her? Why had James been following her? They reached a dead-end alley, and James stopped, scanning their surroundings. "This way," he said, pulling her toward a narrow door hidden between two buildings. The door was barely visible, blending into the shadows. Without a second thought, he pushed it open, and they both slipped inside. The room they entered was small and dimly lit, cluttered with boxes and old furniture. The air smelled of dust and something else, something stale, as though the place hadn't been used in years. But it was secure, and for now, that was all that mattered. James closed the door behind them, locking it with a swift turn of the key. "We're safe for now," he said, his voice breathless. "But we can't stay here long." Emily looked around, her pulse still racing. "What's going on, James? What's happening?" James met her gaze, his eyes dark and tired. The people who've been after you, they won't stop until they get what they want. And if we don't act fast, it'll be too late. We need to take the next step, and you need to remember. You need to remember what happened that night. Everything. I don't know if I can, Emily whispered, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. James nodded grimly. You don't have a choice. We don't have a choice. They're coming for us, Emily. And when they do, we'll need every piece of the puzzle to stop them.